All right, we are back. Still talking about inbreeding avoidance and mechanisms of inbreeding avoidance. One of the mechanisms that has been proposed as a behavioral characteristic that helps individuals avoid inbreeding has to do with growing up from a young age in close proximity with another, individual, potential mate. So there's this quote of childhood propinquity stifles desire. Propinquity meaning you grow up very intimately connected to another person, right? So like siblings, like a brother and sister who grow up from a very young age together. There's just kind of this inborn instinct to not find intimate relationship with that other person appealing, right? So the question is this because you consciously know that this individual is your sibling and your culture has taught you that mating with your sibling is not a good idea? Or is there something instinctual? And if there is, what's the mechanism? So the hypothesis here, of course, there's a cultural component to it. Of course, there's aspects of it that are sort of taught/learned. But in addition to that, the hypothesis is that simply growing up in close proximity with an individual from a very young age kind of instinctually makes you not want to get with them. So there have been a couple of studies that have looked at this with individuals that are not related. So one of them takes advantage of a practice that's dying, but used to be more frequent, called minor marriages in traditional Chinese society. And minor marriages were essentially marriages that were arranged by parents, and they were set when the children were at a very young age, right? So the family of a little boy might choose a wife in concert with the family of a little girl, and they decide on this marriage because their lineages, are both well-to-do, and they want to solidify bonds between them, etc. And what would happen at that point is the daughter, the little girl, would move in with the family of the little boy, and they would essentially grow up together. Now, the marriage itself wouldn't take place until they were older, but it was arranged early, so they would grow up together. That little girl would be adopted into the little boy's family. And so these two graphs show some effects of that. So, for example, this graph on the left, on the x-axis, it shows the wife's age at adoption. How old was this child when she was adopted into her future husband's family? So here we have less than 1 year old, 1 year old, 2 years old, all the way up to greater than 9 years old. And they looked at the fertility rate of those individuals over time, like over the time of their marriage. So how many children did they have in that marriage over the course of the marriage? And they found that the younger the future wife was at the time of adoption, the lower the fertility rate was. So if the wife were adopted into the future husband's family as sort of an infant before the age of 1, the fertility rate, although it's over 5.5, it was significantly lower than if she were adopted into the family, at 10 years old, for example. Then the fertility rate on average was between 7.5 and 8 children over the course of the marriage. So that seems to confirm this idea that growing up from a really young age in close proximity with a person kind of turns you off to them. Another way of looking at it is the duration of the marriage. So on the x-axis, we have how long the marriage lasted, before, say, possibly divorce, or before, one of the individuals passed away, and the cumulative probability of divorce over those years. Okay, so the red line shows individuals whose marriage was arranged at a really young age. So the future wife, the little girl, was adopted into the family before age 1. The blue line shows situations where the little girl was adopted into her future husband's family after age 10, and major marriage, as opposed to minor marriage, is when two individuals, meet and marry as adults. Um, so you see, if they were adopted before the age of 1, the cumulative probability of divorce rises pretty quickly. So already by 5 years of marriage, the cumulative probability of divorce was around 10%, and by 20 years, it was closer to 25%. Compare that to individuals who were adopted after age 10, and the cumulative probability of divorce at 5 years of marriage was about 7%. And at 20 years, it had sort of leveled off to 10 or 11%. And you notice that if the future wife was adopted into the future husband's family after age 10, the cumulative probability of divorce was pretty close to what you would get with major marriage. So this seems to be something that really happens, especially for young individuals. This was also confirmed among individuals on kibbutzim. So a kibbutz is like a utopian almost type of communal society in Israel where individuals would live together, work together, share everything in common. And the children were raised in these age groups. So, children who were born within a few years of each other would essentially be raised together. They would go through whatever kinds of schooling they had to do together. They would work together. They would eat together. So there's a similar kind of situation where from a very young age, you're growing up with this same group of individuals very closely, more so than just like friends, I guess. And so there was a study done of 2,769 marriages from these kibbutzim. Kibbutzim is plural. And only 14 of those were between members of that same peer age group. So again, that points to that if you grow up with individuals from a very young age, you just instinctually are not as attracted to them. You just don't consider them to be viable mates. There's another reinforcement mechanism called egocentric empathy, which basically says that if you have grown up with an opposite sex sibling, that you have this kind of mental mechanism of, I wouldn't want to, have children or marry my sister or brother. So you have this kind of personal experience of that emotion. And if anybody were to mention it, or you saw it in some crazy Netflix show or something like that, you would have a stronger reaction than someone who didn't grow up with an opposite sex sibling. So that's called egocentric empathy. So we can also make some predictions about what individuals would look for in their mates. Now this largely applies to heterosexual mates because we're talking about creating viable offspring. There's no information, at least in your book, on how this might apply to homosexual or other kinds of relations, but basically we looking at the environment of evolutionary adaptation where we were, foragers, hunter-gatherers, and we would be in small communities, you can see the constraints on males and females and how different they are, and you can make some predictions about what they would be looking for in a potential mate based on that. So again, this might be criticized because it seems very reductionist and it seems almost mechanistic, but there's some logic here. So female mammals, like we talked about before, are the ones that carry a child to term, gestate a baby, give birth to the baby, and during that long period of time, there's an opportunity cost where you're not mating with other individuals, you're not creating other offspring. You've only got one shot at a time to have viable offspring. During that time, you need lots of resources. But you have to sort of look out for the health of your growing child, right? So your options and ability perhaps to acquire those resources are limited to some degree. And then once you've given birth, you need to provide for two, really. So it's been shown ethnographically in hunter-gatherer societies that females with children, they consume more than they produce because they are, they're consuming for two. It's not that the mother is consuming it all, but there's a child to consider as well. Males don't have the same constraint, so while the limiting resource for females is access to resources for a mother and her child or children, the limiting constraint for males in terms of reproductive fitness is access to viable reproductive partners. So based on that, we could predict that females would be interested particularly in mates that were that could provide, that were responsible, that would be there to help take care of the children and provide for the mother and the children, whereas males would be interested in mates who show signs of health and fertility and youth, someone who could produce viable offspring. And again, I know that sounds sort of reductionist, but looking at this graph here that shows the fertility rate of men and women at different ages in hunter-gatherer society, you can see that the fertility rate for females peaks around age 25, a little bit before, and then declines fairly quickly after that, up until menopause, around the age of 50, give or take, at which the fertility rate drops to 0. Men tend to sire their first offspring a little bit later, and their fertility continues, although it drops, until around age 55 in this hunter-gatherer society. So it would make sense for males to look for younger mates who are still in their reproductive years. And indeed, when studies have been done about this, that's sort of what we find. There was one study that looked at over 10,000 individuals from 33 countries. You'll notice from this map that most of the countries are, industrialized. The majority of them are sort of Western societies, quote unquote. So it's not a perfect cross-cultural example of humanity, but nonetheless, it's a large sample size. And they had men and women rank traits that they were looking for in potential mates. So you'll see like the first 4 are the same for males and females: mutual attraction and love, dependable character, emotional stability, pleasing disposition, etc. And then there are some discrepancies, and the ones that they found were most consistent cross-culturally were good looks, which was rated higher by males than by females consistently, ambition and industriousness, which was rated higher by females than by males consistently, good cook and housekeeper, which was rated higher by males. Of course, that can be culturally specific as well, which is why you need kind of a larger sample of different types of cultures. And good financial prospect, which was rated higher slightly by females than males, consistently though. So this does kind of support that idea that our mate preferences are influenced, not completely driven, but influenced by this sort of environment of evolutionary adaptation. There was also another study that looked at age preferences for partners, and males and females, in 2 U.S. cities, 1 Philippine village, and then through personal ads in the U.S., Europe, and India. And what they found was, for males, indeed, they consistently, except for the younger age group, were most interested in partners that were younger than them. So the older the males were, the greater the age difference was in the mates that they were looking for, right? So this blue line shows kind of their maximum range, and the red line shows their minimum range. So for a male between ages of 50 and 59, on average, they were looking for mates that were between 5 and 15 years younger than them. Now, you'll notice that, say, for ages 60 to 69, it's not going down to 40 years younger than them, right? They're not typically looking for 20-year-old women, 25-year-old women, which you might assume they would if all they were after were women who were most likely to conceive and who were healthy and young. So this isn't completely driven by evolution. It's also tempered by culture and by, sort of rational decisions individuals make. Most men between 60 and 69 would have no chance of finding a mate who was in her 20s. So, there's some calculation that goes into that as well. For females, however, they found that pretty consistently they were looking for males that were older than them. Now, you'll see the minimum range here drops down for a while to, individuals who are 5 years or so younger than them. But in general, the average line sort of between them stays in a range that's older than these females, right? And, you'll notice that in kind of the sort of later adulthood and middle age, maybe that drops down a little bit. But they're generally looking for males that are older than them, the assumption being that the older the male, the more financially stable. And of course, in the environment of evolutionary adaptation, we weren't talking about money, but that apparently is seen as sort of a proxy for the ability to provide resources in the modern world anyway. There were also studies that looked at the ideal number of mates reported by men and women over different periods of time. So what you see on this x-axis here is within 1 month. What's your, how many sexual partners would you want, sort of ideally? Within 6 months, within a year, within 20 or 30 years, how many sexual partners, would be a good number for you? And they found that, cross-culturally, there was sort of a trend here where men consistently reported wanting more sexual partners than women. Now, of course, that's not true for everybody. And of course, that is culturally influenced. However, the idea here is that, especially in the environment of evolutionary adaptation, so before there were reliable, safe methods of birth control, for a woman to have a sexual partner and quite potentially get pregnant, that is a big commitment, a big risk to take on. So it would behoove you to be a little bit more critical of who your partners were, because that comes with a huge biological expense and opportunity cost again. Whereas for males, because the males are not the ones who are gestating a child, who are bringing it to term, who are giving birth, which is a health risk in and of itself. It's just the stakes aren't as high, right? So males would be it would be more beneficial from an evolutionary perspective for males to try to find access to as many partners as possible. Again, that's something that is influenced culturally, but we see a trend here in the data. However, we also see that it does vary quite a bit cross-culturally. For North Americans, the number of partners desired by both males and females, this is within a 1 month period, is lower on average than in South America, than in Western Europe, than in Eastern Europe, than in Southern Europe. And that may be because of our sort of puritanical roots in our society. You'll notice that the difference between males and females is quite a bit higher in Middle Eastern cultures, and in East Asian cultures, the number of partners desired is a bit lower on average. So although there's variation here, the trend seems to remain the same, that males on average at least report that they desire more partners in any given time frame than females. Now, here on this graph, what we're looking at are, on the left-hand side, we're looking at the trait in a partner that was the most variable over different cultures. So the least constrained by evolution, and that was chastity, which was defined here as having no sexual partners before marriage. On the right-hand side, we find the one that seemed to be most constrained by evolution, that was most consistent across cultures, least variable across cultures, and that was how highly a partner having a good financial prospect was ranked as a desirable characteristic by males and females. If we look at this left-hand chart, we see that in several of these societies, men ranked the chastity of their partner as more desirable than women did. However, in Sweden, women ranked it slightly higher, and in China, women ranked it slightly higher than men did. But you'll note that in Sweden, both men and women said it was pretty close to irrelevant. They didn't care that much. Whereas in China, both men and women said this is quite important. Now, what people report and how they behave are, of course, two different things. But you'll notice there's quite a bit of variation in that cross-culturally here. Whereas when we look at good financial prospect across all of these different societies, women consistently rank that to be more important than men did. In Australia, men were like, that's not so important to me. But women still said that's pretty important. In Nigeria, women found that quite important, and men found it important too, but not quite as much. So this does show that culture, being part of our environment that we grow up in, that we learn from, influences our behavior as well. So it's actually a better predictor if you know where someone is from and what their cultural traditions are in terms of how they're going to behave than evolution is for most of these desired traits, except for good financial prospect. So anyway, that's just a quick introduction to the ways that some of our behavioral and learning mechanisms are shaped by evolution, but also by culture. I will be back next week with our next video, so hang in there, get some exercise, stay safe, wash your hands, and I will see you soon.